Yes, indeed, you read that title right. For today, we're taking a look at the United States Presidents of America and ranking them based on Dragon Quest releases. And we're also going to talk about how Dragon Quest is political. I get about Dragon Quest being political, but I'm not kidding about the whole ranking US presidents based on Dragon Quest releases, as over the years we have multiple Dragon Quest games alongside multiple different presidents over the years, and I'm going to say right now, I'm going to try to keep this apolitical as possible. Obviously, people have varying opinions on these presidents that we'll be talking about here, especially with the more recent presidents. But once again, we're going to try to make this apolitical as possible. There might be some few jokes here and there because of the recency we had with these presidents. But overall, like I said, apolitical, just laugh. Now we have that disclaimer out the way, let's talk about the criteria of how we're going to rank the US presidents. What's the rules? How do each games factor to one game or the other? Well, the first rule is we're only ranking the presidents that had a Dragon Quest release. Obviously makes sense right here. The United States is 260 years old. Dragon Quest is almost 38 years old. So yeah, it doesn't make sense to include someone like George Washington or John F. Kennedy, for example. And the earliest we can go to is Ronald Reagan, seeing how the first Dragon Quest game came out on May 27th of 1986. But you might be wondering, hey, that's the Japanese release date. Wouldn't it make sense to use the United States release dates because we're ranking United States presidents? And I would say yes, that's indeed true, which is why we're also going to include the US release dates for each Dragon Quest game if they have them. And just to let you know, dates are going to play a significant factor. We're going to look exactly when these games released and where they would fall under each president. For example, Dragon Quest V came out in September 1992, still go under Bush Sr. because the elections did not happen until November, and Bill Clinton was not sworn in until January of 1993. And if the North American release came under a different president, makes sense to count it for them. And finally, in regards to how we're going to create this tier list, we're going to have two tier lists. One of them based on mainline releases, and the other one including remakes, re-releases, ports, and spin-off games. And in terms of the rules for these ones, for the mainline release, it has to be the original version of that mainline release. So if that version never had an English localization, we're not counting it at all. We're not going to retroactively include a DS remake just for the sake of having a North American release. It wouldn't be fair for the other games that had North American releases. And as for the remakes and spin-offs, we're limited to only the console releases. We're not going to include arcade games that are Japan only, some weird TV add-on that of course was also Japan only, and a bunch of mobile games to where some of them had their servers shut down. We're not including that, we're only limited to the console releases. So, now we have all those rules out the way, it is finally time to rank. Starting with, Ronald Reagan. Times were good back in the 80s, the economy was great, everyone had money, and jobs were everywhere, and of course the birth of gaming happened with the Famicom and the NES. I know some people will say, well, about Atari. We don't talk about Atari. But of course, one of the major creations under Ronald Reagan was the creation of Dragon Quest, released in May 27th, 1986, and alongside that, we had Dragon Quest II, released in January 26th of 1987. Don't really want to talk about that game. And we had, of course, Dragon Quest III, released in February 10th of 1988. And by the way, I made a review on this game just recently. Card on top. Those are our 3 games released under Ronald Reagan. And I have to say, pretty solid start. How does this rank? Well, I think Dragon Quest II does put it down a little bit. But we have the solid release of Dragon Quest I, and we have the fantastic release of Dragon Quest III that I'm inclined to put Ronald Reagan into the B tier. After Ronald Reagan served his 8 years, we had George Bush Sr. In regards to Dragon Quest, we had some pretty great releases overall. We finally saw the release of Dragon Quest games here in the West, as Dragon Warrior was the first game released in August of 1989, and meanwhile in Japan we saw the release of Dragon Quest IV released in February 11th of 1990, and later down the line we saw Dragon Warrior 2 released in the West in September of 1990, and then Dragon Warriors 3 in March of 1992, and in Japan, Dragon Quest V in September 27th of 1992, and Dragon Warrior 4 released here in the West in October of 1992. So in Japan we had 2 releases, while in North America we had 4 Dragon Quest releases here in the West. That's amazing right there. Even though my opinions about Dragon Quest II aren't the best, regardless, that's amazing that they were able to bring 4 Dragon Quest titles, all 4 of them from the NES, over to the West. That's amazing there. And of course, in Japan, you had the best Dragon Quest game out there being Dragon Quest V. This is an amazing 4 years right here for George Bush Sr. So I'm pointing him to the S tier. Now it's time to move on to Bill Clinton. People talk about how they like the game in the Clinton years, so how does Dragon Quest fare in the 90s? Well, not so well, because this was when NX was having some financial troubles, so we wouldn't be able to get Dragon Quest V here in the West. But in Japan, they got Dragon Quest VI released on December 9th of 1995, and Dragon Quest VII released in August 26th of 2000. Yeah, I'm gonna say it's not a strong year. You guys know already I'm not a huge fan of Dragon Quest VI, and I'm definitely not a big fan of Dragon Quest VII. And I'm not saying these are atrocious releases even though I threw Dragon Quest VII into the trash bin, but these are not solid releases in my opinion. I'm unfortunately going to have to put Bill Clinton into the C tier. Now we move on to Bush Jr., and under his time we saw the release of the English localization of Dragon Quest VII as Dragon Warrior 7, and then later in November 27th of 2004, we got Dragon Quest VIII released in Japan, and then later in North America in November 15th of 2005, which would mark the first time ever Dragon Quest would be named Dragon Quest, as by then Square and Enix would have merged to become Square Enix, and they would also file the trademark for Dragon Quest. And I have to say, regardless of having less and less games over the years, I have to say it's a pretty solid year because of the fact that we have Dragon Quest VIII, one of the best games out there in my opinion. But in comparison to Bush Sr., it definitely pales in comparison because he had 4 games here in the West, while Bush Jr. had 2 games here in the West. So I'm pretty much inclined to put Bush Jr. to the A tier. And now we move on to good old Barack Obama. And during his time, we had the release of Dragon Quest IX released in July 11th of 2009 in Japan, and July 11th of 2010 in North America. And then later down the line, we saw the release of Dragon Quest X, the MMO that refuses to leave Japan, and has been like that since August 2nd of 2012. And I have to say, once again, pretty solid year for Barack Obama. Dragon Quest IX was definitely a big release for many people, and many people do hail as one of their favorite Dragon Quest games, as many people played it as their first game. And of course, people figure out ways to bypass all the VPN stuff with Dragon Quest X, and they're able to play it just fine. But overall, I'm a bit conflicted. I don't think Obama's strong enough to move up to the A tier in my opinion, quite simply because of the fact that Dragon Quest X is still Japan only, but Dragon Quest IX is still a relatively solid release overall. So I'm gonna put him above Ronald Reagan and put him into the B tier. And finally we have Donald Trump, the last person on this list here, and you might be wondering, hey, where's Joe Biden? And I have to say he doesn't count because he's an illegitimate president.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
I kid. Quite honestly, the only reason he's not on this list is because there hasn't been a mainline release under Joe Biden. Plain and simple. So under Donald Trump, we of course saw the release of Dragon Quest XI. And yeah, we only really have one game under Donald Trump. A pretty solid release nonetheless because Dragon Quest XI is a great game, and the one game I recommend to anyone who wants to get into the Dragon Quest series. And this is where quality over quantity comes in for Donald Trump because, like I said, 11 is a great game overall. And for sure, this game has done a lot of good for the Dragon Quest series. It's spread more awareness for the franchise overall. So I am definitely inclined to put Donald Trump into the high B tier alongside Obama. Doesn't get an A tier because of the lack of quantity. And that's the tier list based off the mainline release. But of course we have spin-offs, we have remakes, re-releases, ports over the years. Then it makes sense to make another tier list and see how that would move the needle. As starting with Ronald Reagan, it wouldn't move the needle by much, as the only worthwhile releases to talk about is Dragon Quest I and II released on MSX in Japan in 1986 for Dragon Quest I and 1988 for Dragon Quest II. And for Bush Sr., again, doesn't really move the needle because there wasn't any other spin-offs or re-releases under Bush Sr. But when you move to Bill Clinton, that's when things start to benefit him, as you have the Super Famicom remakes of Dragon Quest I and II and 3, the Game Boy Color remakes of Dragon Quest I, 2, and 3, to which Dragon Quest I and 2 saw released in North America, the introduction of the Tornado Mystery Dungeon in 1993, and Mystery Dungeon 2 in 1999 was a North American release as Tornado The Last Hope, and Dragon Quest Monsters. And this is definitely a solid performance overall when you start including remakes, re-releases, spin-offs, and what have you. As I'm definitely inclined to move Bill Clinton up to the A tier. It doesn't get quite S, as quite simply, a majority of these games are Japanese-only releases. And when you move to George Bush, once again, definitely benefits him overall, as you had Dragon Quest III on Game Boy Color released in North America in 2001, Dragon Quest IV Remake in 2001 as well, the Dragon Quest V Remake on PlayStation 2 in 2004, and then later the Dragon Quest IV Remake on DS in 2007 in Japan and 2008 in North America, alongside the Dragon Quest V Remake on DS in Japan in 2008. And alongside that, you also have some great spin-offs like Dragon Quest Monsters 2 in 2001, Dragon Quest Monsters Caravan Hearts, Dragon Quest Monsters Joker in 2006 in Japan and 2007 in North America, Torneko Mystery Dungeon 2 on Game Boy Advance in 2001, Torneko Mystery Dungeon 3 in 2002 on PlayStation 2, alongside Game Boy Advance, Young Genghis Mystery Dungeon in 2006, the introduction to the Slime Mori series was the first game in 2003 on Game Boy Advance, and Rocket Slime in 2005 and 2006. Dragon Quest Swords, which I don't really know if people like to talk about that game, in 2007 in Japan and 2008 in North America. And the Itadaki Street games was all the Dragon Quest characters you can play as, was Itadaki Street Special in 2004, Itadaki Street Portable in 2006, and Itadaki Street DS in 2007. So definitely very, very solid release for Dragon Quest under George Bush Jr. Though I have to say, a majority of these games are Japanese only. So how exactly would this move the needle for George Bush? Well, for one, I'm inclined to put them to the S tier regardless because the games we did get here in the West are pretty solid releases overall. Dragon Quest III Remake on Game Boy Color, the Dragon Quest IV Remake on DS, Dragon Quest Monsters Joker, Rocket Slime, all great and solid releases overall that I'm inclined to move them up to the S tier. And moving on to Barack Obama, once again we see the same result of greatly benefiting Barack Obama, as we saw the North American releases for the first time ever for Dragon Quest V and VI on the DS. It was Dragon Quest V releasing in 2009, Dragon Quest VI releasing in 2010 in Japan, and 2011 in North America, the Dragon Quest VII remake in 2013 and 2016, definitely stretching right there, Obama, and the Dragon Quest VIII remake in Japan in 2015. And alongside the remakes, we have some great spin-offs like Fortune Street released in 2011, Dragon Quest Wars released on DSiWare in 2009, Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 2, all the 3DS remakes that refused to leave Japan like the Terry Wonderland remake in 2012, Dragon Quest Monsters 2 in 2014, Joker's 3 in 2016, Slime Mori 3 in 2011, and Theatrhythm Dragon Quest in 2015. Kinda sucks seeing how those games were Japanese only. But we still have some other great releases here in North America, like Dragon Quest Heroes in 2015 in both Japan and North America, Dragon Quest Builders, the game that got me into the series, in 2016 in both Japan and North America, and Dragon Quest Heroes 2, which at that time released only in Japan in 2016. And once again, very solid for Obama, but still similar to Bush Jr., half of these games are Japan only, was all the 3DS games. And once again, I have to emphasize, when we take a look at the games that were released here in North America, they're still solid releases overall. Dragon Quest V and VI finally gaining English localizations for the first time, Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 2, Fortune Street is god tier in my opinion, Dragon Quest Heroes is great, and of course Dragon Quest Builders is the one thing that I greatly appreciate because it's the thing that got me into Dragon Quest in the first place. So overall, I'm inclined to move Obama up to the S tier. And now moving on to Donald Trump, we first have Dragon Quest VIII released on the day of Donald Trump's inauguration. I'm not kidding when I say that. The North American release of Dragon Quest VIII on 3DS released on his inauguration. And for sure, when I was doing research on this video, a memory flashed into my mind of how that day went. I remember waking up early in the morning, grabbed my phone to watch the inauguration, sat down and watched Trump say, "I, Donald J. Trump, do solemnly swear to become President of the United States of America." All that shit. And I had breakfast, and I went down to my GameStop to pick up Dragon Quest VIII. Fun day nonetheless. But anyways, aside from that, we also had Dragon Quest 1, 2, and 3, the mobile ports being ported to consoles in 2017 for PS4 and 3DS, and in 2019 for Nintendo Switch. Dragon Quest Heroes English localization in 2017, Itadaki Street 30th Anniversary in 2017, Dragon Quest Builders released on Nintendo Switch in 2018, the one instance to where Dragon Quest released first here in North America, but even though it doesn't really matter too much because it's a port of an old game, Dragon Quest Builders 2 in 2018 in Japan and 2019 in North America, and Dragon Quest XI's in 2019 for Switch and 2020 for all the other consoles. And I have to say, pretty solid overall for Donald Trump, as the majority of these releases had North American releases, from Dragon Quest VIII, Dragon Quest XI's, the mobile ports on Switch, Builders 1 and 2, with a few games here and there being Japanese-only releases like Itadaki Street and the PS4 and 3DS port of Dragon Quest 1, 2, and 3. Solid overall, down moving Donald Trump to the A tier doesn't get quite S because of the sheer quantity of releases. And now we finally move on to Joe Biden, the last person on this list, and Oh boy, let's just go through the list here. We had the Dragon Quest Builders 2 port on Xbox in 2021, which had a day 1 Game Pass release, which pretty nice overall, but still a port of an old game. Dragon Quest X Offline in 2022, which again, a solid release, but Japan only, and you would think the one version of Dragon Quest X that would receive an English localization, which would be this game, still doesn't get one. Yeah, I'm kind of docking points here. Dragon Quest Treasures in 2022 as well, which I already made a video talking about this game. Don't want to talk about it more. Infinity Strash Dragon Quest The Adventures of Dai. Oh god, you're really losing me here, Sleepy Joe. Don't tell me this is Joe over. Dragon Quest Monsters The Dark Prince in 2023. Okay, we're getting better here. We're getting better. And the PC port of Dragon Quest Builders in 2024, which is a pretty solid port overall, but the game's 8 years old. I'm not gonna give him ultra brownie points for a port of an 8-year-old game. And don't get me started with the fact that I was hoping for some Nintendo Direct to come out and bring up Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D because all these insiders, leakers, and what have you were talking about, oh, we're getting a Direct this week, and there was fucking nothing, and I had to literally wait for this Direct to come out and get nothing. I had to give Joe Biden these kid gloves right here, play it fair if Dragon Quest showed up in a Nintendo Direct, and there was fucking nothing. And of course, I am beyond annoyed because I literally waited for jack shit when it comes down to it. So yeah, this is definitely going to contribute to putting Joe Biden to the D tier. Let's go, Brandon. And before anyone says, oh, what if we get a Direct next week and Dragon Quest shows up then? Doesn't matter because I literally had to wait for this and potentially delay this video and get nothing. Plain and simple, he goes to the D tier. So anyways, yeah, that's the presidents ranked on Dragon Quest games. Of course, we had to teach Sleepy Joe a little bit of a lesson, but regardless, I thought majority of these presidents did a great job on this tier list. No one went below C in my opinion, aside from Joe Biden. But I would like to hear from you guys. I would like to see how you guys would rank the United States presidents based on Dragon Quest releases. I'll have the link to the tier list down below so you can make your own, and let me know how you rank them. And if you like this video, consider hitting that like button. And of course, if you want to see more videos, I have a bunch of them, and you can definitely check out these videos here. I think you'll enjoy them. See you guys on the next one. Take care.